Good morning, big dogs. Welcome back into another episode here on Fridays with myself. My name is Adam on the BDGE Dynasty channel. If you're new to the channel, go down and hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss any of the content that we're bringing to you every single week here on the game of Dynasty. I like to focus a little more on the strategy side of things here on Fridays. And today what I want to talk about, obviously at this point, a lot of us have had our 2024 rookie drafts. They're in the books. We've cleared waivers, and we're looking at our roster, and many of us are thinking, all right, my team's ready to go. I want to go win in this 2024 season. And obviously the reason we're all playing is to go ahead and win in 2024. And I'm getting a lot of questions around this topic, and I've seen a lot of trades go down in the Discord in both South Harmon and BDGE as far as teams moving in their future picks in 2025 and 2026 in an effort to make their team that much stronger right now to go ahead and win a title in this 2024 season and become even stronger contenders. And I get all that. Everybody wants to win, but there's some basic concepts and rules that I want to go over when it comes to when I'm going to move in my future picks in 2025 or 2026, let's say, or on the flip side, when I'm going to go ahead and sell players for future picks in 2025 and 2026. I want to go over some basic concepts and rules, exceptions that I've set out for my teams because, truth be told, I've actually had to learn the hard way by making some of these moves at the wrong time. But before we get into all that, you already know what it is. Let's stand up, man. Let's tuck these shirts in. Tuck them. Stop yapping. Let's talk about these future picks. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about it. And if you're thinking about moving those future picks and don't necessarily know if it's the right time or not, stop right now, dead in your tracks. At least listen to all this. You obviously, at the end of the day, make the decision based on the information I'm going to give to you for you to think about. But at least listen to all this before you go ahead and make a trade, trading away your future in 25 or 2026 picks, let's say. And the guideline that I basically set for myself in a Dynasty lineup league is that I'm not going to be moving my future picks away as a general blanket rule until we get to about the midway point through the season, because there's a lot of things, even on a strong contender, that you may not be thinking about when you're looking at your lineup today that can be totally different when you go ahead and take a look at your team and how it's really shaped and formed and assembled come October, November time. And the reason I like to do that, midway through the season roughly in that October, November range, I'm going to have a much better and clearer picture of what the playoff picture in my league actually looks like. Am I a part of this or am I not? Am I on the outside looking in, or am I firmly in this playoff race where at this point now I'm a lot more willing to push my future pick in with the idea of strengthening my team because I know it's not going to be an early pick, or I'm not going to miss the playoffs likely in this scenario. And some big reasons to think about. First thing, right now, if you go to buy a player with a future pick on your team, you're kind of going to be speculating based on what you believe is your starting roster today. However, when we get midway through the season, you're going to have a much clearer picture about what your team actually needs and what about your team are the strong suits. For example, if you have a player at a key position get an injury, obviously you may now know that you need to fill your running back 2 spot or your wide receiver 2 spot. Maybe it's something that you can fill the best available flex, but there may be a situation where you specifically need to go buy a running back or need to go buy a receiver. However, right now when you look at your lineup and you make a trade with your future first, you may end up buying a receiver that's going to realistically be a flex option for you, or maybe be, your first player off the bench. And in reality, you'll have a much better idea of how you should be spending this draft capital come midway through the season versus right now in May or June in the offseason. Now, the second thing is that variance can hit any team. I've had some really great looking teams at this point in the offseason that I think at no chance is this not one of the strongest contenders in the league. But you have to understand, football is an extremely brutal sport. And throughout the year, there are so many different things that can happen as far as injuries go and players that we think are going to be really strong pieces of contenders that underwhelm. For example, when it comes to injuries, guys like Joe Burrow, Anthony Richardson, Justin Herbert, Nick Chubb, Mark Andrews, and the list goes on, are players that ended up missing the entire season, or ended up at least on the season-ending injured reserve. And now, through no fault of your own, because of injury maybe, one of the key players that's going to be scoring a ton of points for you and helping you win games is not available for your roster. And God forbid that it be more than one. You may have Joe Burrow and A-Rich, let's say, from last year. And while you may be able to go to the waiver wire, and even in your league, let's say a guy like Jake Browning was available, and he gave you, decent points, he definitely wasn't the key cog like Joe Burrow was, when Joe Burrow's a difference maker for your team. And likely the rest of your team is not going to be assembled in a way to where you're going to be a strong contender. And while sure, you have a chance to go win the title, you may have pushed in a future first where you're not actually likely at this point to make the playoffs. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be season-ending IR. For example, a guy like Justin Jefferson, who ended up finishing the year and on certain teams in the playoffs was actually someone that helped you in certain spots for the playoffs. He missed 9 weeks during the regular season. So if you held on to him through that entire time during the regular season, your team may not have been strong enough to actually make the playoffs without Justin Jefferson. You have a guy like Tyreek Hill, who maybe was a big part of getting you to the playoffs, but all of a sudden he gets hurt at the worst time, and in week 1 of the playoffs, he's unavailable to you. Then you have guys like Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, who many people were relying on in a big way to be difference makers in points per game when it comes to their team, but hit the lull at the worst time, getting to the playoffs, defining if you're going to get a bye or not, or ultimately in the playoffs underwhelming. So a lot of these things you can have a lot clearer picture on if you go ahead and try to hold that pick a lot closer to the deadline, and you might be able to have a better indication of what your team actually needs, whether it's guys that are underperforming or it's guys that are actually out for the season, and you need to fill a hole there where realistically the option that you had on your bench just isn't going to get it done. And there's been plenty of times in the past where maybe I buy a player that I really strongly am convicted on. I really believe in this player, so I move my future first, and maybe even in certain spots I had to move a first plus to go get this player, which I thought was a very big discount or just too good of a value to pass up. So in that scenario, though, you have to understand that you carry all the risk that comes associated with that player when you move your future first in. So, for example, I'll give you some bad ones that really hurt me in years prior. Typically, they were around the running back position, but it wasn't just the running backs. But I'm going to give you the ones at running back that stand out for me. So Cam Akers and J.K. Dobbins both come to mind as players going into the 2021 season that people were valuing very highly in the game of Dynasty. These are guys that were being drafted in the second and third round of startups at the time and were coming off of really great rookie seasons. And a first round or even a first plus felt like a cheap deal to go get these type of players. But when you make them and they get hurt, their value, once that season-ending injury takes place, their value sinks a ton. And at this point, you're hoping maybe to get out just for a single first as far as future value, or you're going to have to end up holding this player on your bench. Maybe you can make a pivot for a different positional player, but likely you're going to be taking a huge discount on what you paid for that player when that injury comes around. The following season after that, Javonte Williams going into the 2022 season comes to mind. Russ was in town. People thought this Denver offense was going to be really potent. Javonte Williams had a bunch of catches in that week 1, but eventually got hurt very early in the season, and now you have this dead weight on your roster that simply is not worth anywhere near that future first that you thought you were trading away from a contending team. Now, with all that said, if I'm going to be looking at a potential deal that's going to include my 2025 first, let's say, these are some things that I'm going to be doing, and the first thing I need to do is weigh the risk and reward when it comes to whatever player or group of players in a package that I'm going to be receiving and whatever the potential deal that's out there is. And when we basically cut to the chase as far as the risk and reward, it's going to lead to this being the main exception and really the only exception to this rule, as far as I'm not going to be moving my future picks unless it's midway through the season and I have a much clearer picture of where my team stands as far as making the playoffs and being one of the stronger teams that's certainly going to make the playoffs in this league. And when it comes to the exception to the rule, think about it this way. Obviously, if I'm going to be making this type of a trade, even if I'm including more than just my future first, not only does the player have to be extremely highly valued in Dynasty, but in my estimation, this is going to be somebody that has a lot of value insulation attached to them. Now, when I talk about this value insulation, what I'm really meaning by that is that if this player produces in a mediocre fashion, let's say this player is scoring more at a mediocre clip and isn't quite giving me that elite points per game or the difference-making potential that I was hoping for in this player that's highly valued in Dynasty, or this player gets injured, I'm looking to know that that player is not going to dip catastrophically in value if those two things are happening when I'm weighing out the risk and the reward. And likely this player, even when injured or is performing at a mediocre clip, is still going to be somebody that's appealing to a good amount of my league. Now, if you're a little confused about that, I certainly understand it. And I'm going to give you some examples, some things to look at in the past as far as the players and the groups of people that I'm meaning when I'm talking about this type of value insulation. And the reality is it's going to make a very short list of players and specific types of players that I'm looking to acquire if I'm actually going to be pushing in my 2025 pick, let's say, in this season. So let me give you some examples. A guy like Jamar Chase in the 2022 season actually was hurt for a decent amount of time leading into the playoffs of that season. And if you look at Keep Trade Cuts lifetime value on a guy like Jamar Chase, even during that window, of him not playing in 2022, there really wasn't a massive dip in value. Certainly a little bit, but nobody was trading Jamar Chase at a massive discount. And if they did, they made a huge error at that time. You could basically make the exact same comparison this season, as I already touched on with a guy like Justin Jefferson. He missed 9 weeks. And while that's a huge amount of time, people in Dynasty know how young and how good Justin Jefferson was. And while you could possibly acquire him, you really weren't going to get a massive discount. If you take a look at his keep trade cut value as well, his overall Dynasty value basically did not really dip at all. So his value insulation, Jamar Chase's value insulation, basically allows you that even if they get hurt or they aren't scoring at a huge clip like Jamar Chase was this season when Joe Burrow went down, the value on those players really isn't going to dip a lot. And you have an asset that isn't going to crater in the worst case scenario. Now, obviously, those are two of the most valuable wide receivers in the game today. But let me give you some examples of guys a little lower down the board and didn't necessarily get hurt. So Drake London, for me, is one that comes to mind. And I can point to where you're looking at 2 full seasons. Drake London in his rookie and sophomore year finished at wide receiver 31 and 37. So his first 2 years was definitely not a difference maker, but you can point to the fact that there wasn't necessarily the greatest quarterback play, and at moments he shined and flashed, but because he's so young and people believe in this talent so much, his value never really dipped a ton. Now, if you take a look at the entirety of his lifetime value on Keep Trade Cut here, you can see that there are a little bit of valleys, but overall, he never dipped below wide receiver 24. And for the majority of this time, he was valued inside the top 15 and a lot of times even inside the top 12. But the point is, despite his mediocre production, there was things that you can point to because he's a young receiver. We're going to make excuses and reasons why it's going to be better in the future. So his value, even when he wasn't producing, didn't crater and dip a huge amount. And if you take a look at the 22 class guys like Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, you're basically looking at the same picture, but not quite as extreme as it was with Drake London. And even if you take a look at the worst case scenario there, in that class with a guy like Treylon Burks. Now, Treylon Burks actually was never valued inside the top 15. So that's going to be one of the caveats that's basically going to put him outside of the range of comfortability for me if I'm going to be buying. But just to stick with this one and show you the entirety of it, while Treylon Burks now is a significant, massive cratering value, if you take a look at his lifetime value and you look at the first year, basically if you look at March of 2022 to March of 2023, inside that full year, he really never dipped all that much more than a guy like Drake London. So while Treylon Burks certainly is a player now that we can look in hindsight and say, yeah, that was a terrible bust, you basically had a full year of value insulation with Treylon Burks. And at this time next year, you were still able to trade Treylon Burks for a significant value that was somewhat in the range of a future first. And then if you take a look at a guy like Trevor Lawrence. Now, Trevor Lawrence, the reason I want to talk about him is Caleb Williams, to me, is one of the guys that definitely fits this bill. These guys are viewed as generational talents at the quarterback position. Now, Trevor Lawrence, if you think about it, with Urban Meyer in his rookie season and all the way through right now, he's never actually been an elite producer at the quarterback position. In 2022, he definitely showed the most upside that he's had for us in fantasy football, but at no point throughout him playing has he been an elite difference maker at the position. And if you take a look at his lifetime value, he's been basically anywhere from quarterback 5 to quarterback 12 through the large majority of his lifetime over 3 seasons. So Trevor Lawrence is another guy that has a ton of value insulation, basically based off of the fact that we believe that he's a generational prospect, and we're going to give him a ton of time, even if it's not great right out of the box initially. So when you look at a guy like Malik Neighbors, let's say, right? Malik Neighbors has Daniel Jones throwing the ball, and even if he doesn't actually produce at a super meaningful rate this year, he's probably going to have enough highlight plays and enough production, unless he doesn't meet a certain threshold, he's going to be value insulated, and we're going to make excuses about the situation he's in, much like Drake London. You take a look at a guy like Caleb Williams, much like Trevor Lawrence, he's viewed as a generational prospect, so even if Caleb Williams isn't a top 12 producer at the position in his first year, we're going to give him more time because we do believe that he's a generational prospect. And basically when I'm looking at what the players are that going to fit this bill, you're going to be looking at guys in the range of these type of names. So Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, CJ Stroud, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, regardless of them all not necessarily being the youngest, even if something bad was to happen to them this season, as far as them getting a serious injury, they're not going to fall significantly in value. Obviously, now at the receiver position, guys like Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Marvin Harrison Jr., guys in this type of range just aren't going to have that significant fall off in dynasty value. And realistically, though, that's a very short list of names. I'm not saying that you can't necessarily buy other ones. A guy like Malik Neighbors or Rome Odunze, I can make the case for that also fits that bill. But the point is, these are very few and far between the players that meet this criteria for the exception. But basically, if I'm going to break the rule of waiting until midway through the season to trade away my future first, these are the type of players I'm looking to get. Now, obviously, you're not likely to grab one of these players for just one pick in the 2025 class. But the point is, if I'm moving my 2025 future first, even if I have to add more to it, I need to be getting guys in this range. Otherwise, I'm just going to hold my future first and wait until midway through the season. And while I may not be able to actually at that point get a Malik Neighbors, I'll have a much clearer picture of what type of player I need to buy. And when I actually go ahead and make this trade, I'm not going to be potentially handing over somebody a 102, 103 in this 25 class. Pretty much got to be quarterbacks or wide receivers. Running backs in general really do not fit this bill, and they don't have that value insulation if something catastrophic happens to them in injury. So for example, a guy like Christian McCaffrey, if he was to get a significant injury, you're talking about the floor falling out on his value, and not very many people are going to be looking to acquire a guy coming off a serious injury, and all the injuries that he's had in his past are likely going to be, things that are pointed to now in a guy like Christian McCaffrey. Pretty much the only running backs that might be able to fit this bill are going to be guys like Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs. Even a guy like Breece Hall, while I think he's a tremendous talent and super meaningful potentially for teams, as you saw how good he was in the back half of the season, if he had an injury, knock on wood, we don't want this to happen, but if he did have an injury that took out his season this year, he'll be going into year 4, the last year of his rookie contract, and now will be coming off a second significant injury in his career. And as much as I love Breece Hall, it's just not a bet I'm willing to make right now as far as pushing in my future first. I get it if you do, and for me, I don't actually think Breece Hall necessarily meets the criteria to be the exception for the rule. What I want to do is give you both sides of it. I want to give you an example of one of the trades that I've made, which actually really fits more the exception to the rule, where I moved in my 2025 first ahead of schedule from the normal rule, and then also talk about not just that. Obviously, there's going to be some teams I have where my 25 first is still sitting there waiting to be traded in midseason. And I also want to give you an example of the further extreme, where if there are some people that are really looking to make a push and make their team in the mix of a contending team right now, I'm probably going to be one of the teams that's willing to shed some excess when I have it and actually pick up that extra future pick. So let's go over the first one, the exception to the rule. I'm trading away the 106 in this class, my future 2025 first, as well as the 208 in this class. I'm receiving back the 102, the 212, and a 25 second. Now, the crux of the deal in and of itself is obviously going from the 106 to the 102, and to do that, I had to send away my 2025 first, and I got back my 2025 second. Now, at the time, I know a lot of people were actually like, oh, no, this is a bad process trade. You shouldn't be moving this. I'd rather have the 106 and the future first as opposed to the 102. And I certainly understand, making that process trade. But the reason I think this was such an important trade for me to make is, one, I needed to get that second high-end quarterback in Superflex. And when I made this trade, that 102 becomes Caleb Williams. And not just that, Caleb Williams is very value insulated. I talked about the case with Trevor Lawrence. And I also feel like Caleb Williams gets me to the table in a conversation of potentially trading Caleb Williams into a guy that is much more meaningful, like a Lamar Jackson, a Josh Allen, someone in that realm, where 106, for the record, that became Drake May. And while I like Drake May quite a bit, there's a range of outcomes for Drake May where, first of all, he may not actually get me to a serious conversation with the elite quarterbacks. And secondly, let's take a look at a guy like last year. Take a look at a guy like Bryce Young. If he's in a bad situation, and we think right now Drake May is in a little bit of a sketchy situation, if he has a pretty poor rookie season, you could be looking at some value loss for a guy like Drake May. And it's not that I don't think highly of the prospect of Drake May or that he's potentially good enough to overcome the situation, but I do think Caleb Williams gets me to a totally different conversation in future trades, as well as at this time next year, if I still had a guy like Caleb Williams, I don't think that it's very likely, given the fact that people view him as generational and he's surrounded with a lot of weapons, that his value takes a massive nosedive. Whereas a guy like Drake May, I just don't see that same certainty. So whether you agree or disagree with the process, the reason I made this trade is it filled a spot that I really needed. It gave me a quarterback in Superflex that's inside the top 10, and I believe a lot more value insulated than many other people in Dynasty. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the other end of the spectrum, where I talk about, in the right situation, actually trading off of a player that realistically could be a part of a contending team, but that doesn't really fit this criteria of being super value insulated and actually moving off of that piece of excess to get more draft capital in the future class. So this team here, I have Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes as my quarterbacks. I have Saquon Barkley, Isaiah Pacheco at my running back 1 and 2. I've got Tyreek Hill, Marvin Harrison Jr., A.J. Brown, Brandon Ayuk, and I actually have DJ Moore and Cooper Kupp on the bench. I have David Njoku, Kyle Pitts, and Travis Kelce at tight end. So I'm pretty flush all the way around. And this is one of those teams that you could say, man, this is kind of like that Titanic. There's no way that you're going to be able to sink this ship. Now, while there's probably some truth to that, the reality is variance can hit any team. But just think about it from this perspective. If I move my 25 first in, a late 25 first on this team, I'm very unlikely to get in the conversation of any type of these very value insulated players in Dynasty like I'm talking about, meeting the exception to the rule. So I'm holding on to my 25 first here. But this team used to have Devon Achane, and there was a guy that's looking to contend, and he probably is on the verge of contending. He is trying to get Devon Achane from me. I also know he's a Dolphins fan. So we make this trade here. He sends me his 25 first, 25 second, and 25 thirds to go ahead and get off of a guy that weekly, we know Devon Achane has the upside to be a league winner a lot of times, and I didn't really need to get off of Devon Achane, right? You take a look at this trade, and while all those picks are nice, many people still may be saying, well, I'd rather just have Devon Achane. He could end up being a league winner, and I get it. He's a top 10 running back in Dynasty, no questions about it, and while you can make that case, the opposite still for me is actually what I prefer to have. You could definitely say in the range of outcomes that if Devon Achane stays healthy and plays at his highest potential, that he's worth more than this 25 first, second, and third, no question. And although we've seen him be extremely potent, we also saw him miss a lot of time, and plenty of weeks he wasn't actually nearly as valuable to your team. So if I look at the range of outcomes with Devon Achane, he's not one of these value insulated guys. If something bad happens to him again, he's probably going to go down quite a bit as far as Dynasty values. But if you think about it conversely, on the flip side of this, right? Let's say we fast forward this team. Now, if something happens in an absolutely catastrophic fashion to multiple pieces on this team, and this team is not in the playoff mix, I have my 25 first. I could just simply not make the playoffs, and I still have my 25 first, which is going to be early. But I'm not necessarily pulling myself out of contention right now for no reason. Completely understand not wanting to do that. But now, if I am in the playoff mix, right? So I'm going to make the playoffs. I'm clearly a top 3-4 team. There's no way that I'm going to miss the playoffs. At this point now, while my 25 first is late, I'm looking at a team that's more on the middle side, and we'll see where this 25 first actually ends up being from his team. But even if you tell me that these are going to be two potential playoff teams, those two 25 first plus a 25 second, I have enough ammunition in futures to probably go buy nearly any running back I want in a Superflex league. Just think about it from that perspective. If you get to the point of sending almost 3 first for any player in a Superflex league, you have a chance of getting there. So even if I wanted to go get a Bijan Robinson, a Jahmyr Gibbs, certainly an aging guy like Christian McCaffrey, I have enough in future picks, plus adding some of these players that I have on my roster to a trade to get myself in a conversation of almost any running back I want. So I don't have to carry that risk of Devon Achane, and I have a team that's arguably strong enough to hold off any real catastrophic thing happening because I have so much value, and it's excess for me at Devon Achane. He's not someone that I have to start every week because I have Pacheco and Barkley on this team. So that's really the scenario that I wanted to go over with you. Sometimes I think we are so focused on wanting to have a team that's contending that we don't think about what's actually sitting in reserves for us. And these future picks, a lot of times if you hold on to them and move them at the right time, those are going to be more valuable in a player that's a lot more volatile, like Devon Achane or even some guys further down the list, where if things happen catastrophically, there's a ton of value loss that could be coming for them, where these future picks are going to be value insulated. There's only 12 picks in a 12-team league, so 2 first out of that is going to give you a significant chance to go buy someone meaningful at the right time in Dynasty. Anyway, that's all I got. I wanted to go over this with you, this simple concept of when is the right time to move your future picks in. And before you go ahead and get over your skis and start moving futures in 25 and 26, make sure you're starting to weigh all the options and you're thinking about the type of player you're receiving back in a trade like this. I hope this was valuable for you. Let me know down in the comments what you think of this. If you think this is a smart, savvy strategy, or if you think this is crazy. I'm sending my futures in. I don't care about all the repercussions. I'm playing to win right now. I don't need to wait until midway through the season. Let me know all that in the comments, and I'll see you back here, same time, same place, talking more Dynasty strategy and trades. I'm out of this thing. Peace.